Many times in your programming, you have some statements that you need to record over and over again. One of the powerful things provided, in fact, by all programming languages are loops. So in this video, we will introduce the for loop of the Python language. I'll begin with this program. I have some lists already defined, and I've used these in previous videos. And let's suppose we want to print out the items in a list. Now we already know that we can print out any sequence of items from a list that we want to. For example, if I wanted to print out from the ranks list, if I wanted to print out 0 to 0, 1, and 2, then I could do that by using this range, position 0 up to position 2. And remember that the 2 is the stopping point, so we don't really get that. We just get the 0 and the 1. And similarly with the Western states, if I wanted to print out indices 2, 3, and 4, then I could do it like that. So we know that we can do that, and let's just run the program and remember what that looks like. So you can see we just get a sublist from the list of ranks and from the list of Western states. So this is printed out as a list, right? So we get the brackets on the end and we get the commas in between. Now let's suppose we wanted to print out all the items in a list, but we only want to print them out one per line. Well, how can we go about doing that? If we wanted to print one per line, then we'd need to have a print statement that printed out each item one by one. So let's look at the code that can do that. If we wanted to print from the list of our the list called apes, one per line, then we could do it like this. First of all, I'm going to print out the entire list just with the print statement for apes. But if we want to just print out one at a time, then we have to use the index of each one. So this would print the first item in the list of apes, which is Homo sapiens. So that would go to one line, and then we move down and we'd print out the next item that goes on the next line, and so on as we go through the list. So let's take a look now at the output for these 4 lines. Here's the output. So from the bottom 4 lines that you see here, we get the Homo sapiens is an ape, so that's the first item, and pan-troglodytes is the second item in the list. Gorilla is the last one. And notice that those are printed out on 3 separate lines. We don't have any special notation there. We don't get the commas, we don't get the brackets, and we don't get the quotes around them. So if this is the way you want to print information to the screen, then there's a better way for us to go about doing that. In the code, this is repetitive, right? We print apes 0, then it's identical, we just change the index to 1, then the next line is identical, we just print apes with index number 2. Well, all languages, including Python, give us a way to do this in a much easier syntax, and that is the for loop. So now I want to show you how to use a for loop to print out exactly the same information. So we begin with this code, and I'm going to print to the screen, now use a loop so that we can see the output and it can explain what's going on with our program. And then I'm just going to skip a line with the \n. Now let's look at this line here. This is a loop. Notice the syntax very carefully here. A for loop starts with the word for, and it's a reserved word. So we can't use a variable called for. So these words that show up in this orange-blue color, orange or yellowish color, those are called reserved words, and we can't use them as variables. Same thing with in. Now there's a colon over here at the end to terminate this first line of the for loop. What this is doing is the following. For the list apes, we want to pull out an item one at a time. So that's what this does. We are going to get the first item in apes, and then we're going to do something with it down here below the for statement. Then we'll do the next item, and we keep going until we get through the entire list. Now let's add the code that we have for the internal part of the loop. Okay, so I'll just hit the enter and I'll do a paste. So this is just going to print out the items that are in the list. So for item in apes, we get the first item, we print that item out, and then we're going to print the string constant is an ape afterwards. Now this will do the same thing that we did up here using a change of index for every line. This is going to pull out an item, it's going to print it, then it goes back up here, it gets the next item, and then we print it. It goes back up here, we get the third item, and then we print it. And this continues until we print out every item in the list. Okay, so in this instance, we have a loop that's going to print out all the items in the list one line at a time. All right, so now let's see what the code produces in this case. I'll bring the output over and look at the bottom three lines. Okay, so we have the Homo sapiens, Pan troglodytes, gorilla, gorilla. So in these last three lines, that was produced by this loop. So the loop can print out all the items in a list, and you only need to have one print statement that's inside the loop. So this line of code is repeated over and over again until we reach the end of the list, in this case, the list of apes. So these loops are very powerful, and they're constantly used in programming languages to where we can write a small amount of code that can do some repetitive statements like we have here. At this point, I need to introduce something that's really important, and it's one of the features of Python that you're probably going to dislike. It may cause you a lot of trouble. It causes me a lot of trouble. And that's the indent. Notice that the print statement is indented from the left-hand side of the page. Let's take away the indent. If I just back it up so that the F is aligned with the P, then notice what happens when I try to run the program. Okay, so I'll click OK. And there's an error. Okay, it says it expected an indented block. And there's a little red block here indicating that there's something wrong with the line where the print is. So this is one of the things with Python you must be very careful with, and that's the indentation. So I'm going to just click OK. This is an error. So inside a loop, you must indent every line that belongs to that loop. So if I go back, and I can do it a couple of ways. I can use the tab to go over, or if I just want to use the space key, I can just move over one space, and now this will work just fine. So now the output works just fine. Let's bring it back up. So now the program runs. So it all has to do with that space over here on the left. So this one space is considered an indent. Okay, you can also use the tab. I mean, if I hit enter, then it automatically puts a tab there. But you need to be very careful with that, because sometimes you can mix up tabs and you can mix in spaces and they don't match up. So you need to stick with one or the other. So either use tabs or use spaces to make sure these things line up. Let's put another line of code in here. I'm just going to hit enter, and I'm going to paste in another print statement, and this will print out in the loop. Now, each time we go through the loop, both of those print statements will execute. And because they're indented the same amount, that means that both of the print statements belong to this loop. So let me demonstrate that. Now you can see the output when I bring it up. This prints out the first item, which is the first ape, and we print out in the loop as well. Then we print out the second ape, we print out in the loop, and so on. So these two lines, these two print statements, they're executed 3 times because there are 3 items in the list apes. Now let's modify this program just a bit. Let's change the indentation. So for the second print statement, I'm just going to have it here, which is indented a little bit differently than the print item up above it. This is also an error. So let me show you the result when you try to run the program like this. Okay, so here we go. And we get an error again. Okay, this says something about indentation. The unindent does match any other indentation. So what I want to try to impress upon you here is that the indentation makes a world of difference when you're dealing with loops. So it has to be consistent, otherwise Python is going to give you these error messages. So let me click OK to stop this one. Now, we can correct this just by going in and putting our space back in there so that things align. Okay, so that alignment has to be the same. Now, I want to do one other thing here. I'm going to put another statement here. We have print in the loop. I'm going to put a statement also after the loop so we can see what happens when the loop ends. Okay, so let's put another statement down here, Control V. So this print statement is not inside the loop. Okay, it's aligned over on the left side, the same as 4, which means it's not inside the loop. Only things that are indented are part of the loop itself. So let's see what happens now when we run the program. So here is the result. Inside the loop, we get the 6 outputs. We print out the item that's in the list apes. So we do that here. That goes through the loop 3 times. Then we print out not in the loop at the bottom. So this print statement at the very bottom, that's not part of the loop. So we have exited the loop after we did this print in the loop statement. So this for loop contains these 2 lines. If I happen to move this line over, print not in the loop, if I moved it over so that it aligned with the others, now it's inside the loop. So wow, look at that. So it's very important. So let me show you again what happens if these are all aligned. Okay, now we get the result. It's here somewhere. Now, notice what the output looks like. We have the name of the ape, we have in the loop, but we also print out not in the loop. We do that 3 consecutive times, and you see the output here on the screen. So that means now that this last print statement is part of the loop. So this is kind of unusual in programming languages. In almost all other languages, there's some kind of delimiter for a loop. In the C programming language as well as Java, you can actually put, and this doesn't work in Python, but I'll show you anyway. In some languages, you can actually put curly braces around the things that you want to be in the loop. Okay, so that is the way we would do it if we were coding in C, but we're not. So this doesn't work with Python, so we can't use those things. And in some languages, there's actually a statement that ends the loop, like an end for. Okay, well, that doesn't work in Python either. So we are required to use an indentation technique to group things together that go in a loop. And it can be very confusing, and it can be very frustrating for you if you happen to get these indentations mixed up. Okay, so let's take that out. And I just want you to remember, and you may need to come back to this, the indentation is really critical when you're working with the body of a loop. You know, the body being the elements or the coding statements that are inside the loop itself. Now, I want this not in loop to be outside the loop, so I'm going to put it over there. And there's something I like to do when I'm writing in Python, and that's to put a comment. When I'm finished with a loop, even though there's no special way other than the indentation, I would like to put something here that tells me that this is the end of the loop. So I'd like to put a comment there. Comment end of for loop. So that just helps me to understand that these 2 lines are in the loop. This line down here is after the loop. So you might want to use those comments as well. Now let's move on and let's look at some other examples of using these for loops. I'm going to add the code for another loop, and we'll go through it line by line. So here is another for loop. Notice that all of the lines inside the loop are indented the same, so all 4 of these lines are part of the loop. It's another loop that goes through the list of apes. So we're going to now do a little analysis on the items that are in the list. So let's get the length of each one of the apes. So that gives us the number of characters in each one of these things. So we'll use the len function to determine that. And notice that we're using item here. Okay, item is pulled from the list apes. So the first item is going to be Homo sapiens. We'll get the length of that because the variable item contains Homo sapiens the first time through. And we can use that variable the same way we would use the string itself so that we can get the letter at position number 0. So the first letter is just item at index 0. Then let's print that information out to the screen. So we will print the item. So that's the item from the list. We will concatenate it is an ape. Its name starts with a letter. and we'll concatenate the first letter. So this is just an example of some processing you can do with a list, but you can do it in a more generic fashion by using it inside the for loop. The last part of this is just another thing I wanted to show you. You don't have to use the plus between everything if you don't want to. And in particular, in some instances, if you have things that are numbers instead of letters or strings, like here we have strings, so they concatenate easily. The name length is going to be an integer value. And normally, we would have to put a plus sign here and convert this to a string. There's another way to do that, and I'm showing you that here. Okay, if you don't want to do the conversion of an integer to a string, then you can separate these things with commas. Okay, so that's another way to do it. You can always separate multiple items in a print statement with commas, and it works just fine. Now, let's look at the result of the code that we have in this for loop. Okay, here's the output. Wow, okay, so we are here. Okay, this is the loop that I just wrote for item and apes, this last for loop down here. Okay, so we pull out the first item in the list and we print it out with this print statement down here. So here's the item, Homo sapiens. Okay, it is an ape and starts with the letter H. Great, okay. So then we loop through again. Well, the last statement is we print out how many letters it has. Okay, so it's got 12 letters. Then we go through the loop again. So the second pass through the loop, we pull out the second item from the list. We print out the same information, you know, how long it is. We go through the loop a third time because we have 3 items in the list. So we pull out the last ape, we print it out, first letter, and it also is 15 characters in length. So you get the idea. If you want to go through a list of items, then this for loop is an excellent way to do it. In fact, you know, the for loop and the list capability with Python, those kind of really go together. Now let's terminate this for loop and let's do another example. So I'm just going to paste in some comments that I have. So this is going to tell me, hey, I've reached the end of this loop. Let's move on. The next thing I want to show you is let's calculate the average from the high temperatures. So we had a list of temperatures that I've used in other videos. So now let's just use that and let's see if we can figure out the average of those high temperatures. So we'll do a calculation this time. Since I'm moving to another example, I want to skip some space on the output. So I'm going to print out just this double quote \n\n. So that puts a blank line between the output that we did from the print statement up there and what we're going to do now. If we want to get the average, then we need 2 things. We need to know the sum of all of those numbers, and we need to know how many there are. Then we just divide in order to get the average. So I'm going to make a new variable. I'm going to call it sum, and I'll set it to 0. So we're going to do a cumulative addition of all of these temperatures in the variable sum. So we'll add up all those numbers and we'll divide by how many we have. So we can use a loop to do that. So the loop looks like this. We want to go through the loop we want to go through the list high temperatures using the loop. So we will pull out the first temperature that's in the list and we will add it to sum. Now this line might look a little weird to you. And this is a programming language statement. This is not math. Certainly, it is not algebra. It does not work that way. What this is saying is we want to take the value of temp, we want to add it to the current value of sum, then we want to save that as the new value for sum. So sum starts with 0. We take the first temperature, then we add that temperature to sum, which was 0 the first time. Then we save this addition in the variable sum. So now sum will contain the first temperature, which is 88.9. Then we go through the loop again, and we pull out the second temperature, which is 91.5. And this time, sum is the value from the first number. We add the 91.5 to that, so now we've added the first 2 numbers, and we save the sum in the variable sum. So this loop is just going to add up all of the temperatures in the list high temperatures. So once we have that, then we need to know how many there were. Well, do you know of a way? Do we know how many elements there are in the list? Yeah, well, we do. And the number can be determined by the length. So I'm going to use another variable here. I'll just type this one in. So let's do num temps. And that's just equal to the length of the list, length of the high temperatures. So that tells us how many there are, and we have the sum. So now it's easy, we can print out the average. So let's compute the average. So the average is the running sum, the cumulative sum divided by the number of temperatures we have. Then we need to print those values out. So now let's paste in some print statements. So this will print out the sum. We want to see what the sum is. So I'm using this technique here. Okay, we have the string constant, and since sum is going to be a real number, we have to convert it to a string if we want to use the concatenation operator. And down here you can use the other technique. You can choose the one you want. In this case, I don't need to do the string part of this. If I put a comma there, I can just print out the average without doing any conversion. So this then will print out our total sum, and it'll print out the average. So let's see what we get from this. Okay, so here's the output. Now one thing you'll notice is we got a lot of numbers over here on the right. So let's just ignore most of those. So the sum of the temperatures was 742.80, and then if we divide by how many we have, we get the average, which is 92.85. So this is a simple calculation, and it shows you some math that you can do with Python. And I can't leave this without showing you how you can control this output format. So what I'm about to show you really is kind of jumping ahead quite a bit, but I want to show you how it works, and we will look at doing some formatting in some other videos down the line. But I just want to show you a way that you can control that now, so if you don't want to see this, then you can just remember how to do what I'm about to show you. Now this gets a little bit cryptic. I've added quite a bit of stuff into our print statement here. First of all, if you do want to format something, then there is this method called format that's available. So we know it's a method because it follows a dot, and the thing that I want to format, you can put in parentheses here. So if you want to format the sum, then you can use format and then in parentheses the variable that you want to format. So same thing here with the average. The thing that's really cryptic is these statements or these characters here. So we have these curly braces on each end, and it's inside the double quote for one thing. So it looks like a comment, but it isn't really. So you will not see this printed out. This is a special kind of indicator that tells us that we want to output this variable in a certain form. So just remember that this is how it works, and we'll get into this formatting much later. But if you use the curly brace, colon, and a dot 2, then the dot 2 is going to give you only two numbers to the right of the decimal. So that's what the dot 2 does here, and the dot 2 does there. The F part of this means that this is a floating point variable. Okay, sum is floating point, average is floating point. Well, what is a floating point? That's a weird sounding term. In a programming language vernacular, that means it's a real number. So an F, when you see a floating point or an F, that's a real number as opposed to an integer. So I'm just going to put this in here, and we'll see how that formats the output to clean it up a bit. But it's not something you really need to remember at this point. Okay, so now let's look at the output. So now it's cleaned up. See, the average 742.80, so that's a much nicer output than all those other digits that we saw earlier. And then the high is 92.85. So you can do calculations with Python, certainly. You can in all programming languages. Now let's finish up this video with one more example of a for loop. It turns out that these strings that we've been looking at, you can treat those as a list. So let's suppose I've got a variable called state, and I've just set it to Colorado. I want to make a table. The table is going to give the position of each letter. Remember, we start with 0 as the index of the first one. And I'm going to print out the position. I'm going to print out the letter that belongs to that position. But I want to use a for loop to do that. Okay, so let's put a for loop in here. So I'll paste the code for that. And I've got a little header for the table. I'm going to print out a column header like index and then the letter that goes with that index. I'm going to use the for loop and I'll treat state as a list. Okay, so for the letter that's in the string state, I'm going to print out the position and I'm going to print out the letter that goes with that position. Let's paste in the code. And inside the loop, I want to print out the position, which starts with 0. Then, if I want to make a table, I'm just going to put some spaces on the screen. So this is just a double quote with some spaces, 5, I think, closed by a double quote. And then I'll print out the letter that is at that given position. Okay, now I'm going to move the position over one by one each time. So position 0 to start, we add 1. Next time through the loop, I'll print out position 1. So you can see how position changes, and we can see the letters when we run the program and we run this loop. Now again, I have put the comment end of loop here to remind me that I'm at the end of the loop. Recall, indentation is critical, so be aware. It has to be the same. Okay, so let's now run this example. I'll bring in the output. So here is our table. So here we print index and we print letter, and then we get into the for loop. So we pull out the first letter, which is C in Colorado. So at index 0, we get a C. And when we do the print, that means we go to a new line every time. So we go to the next line, and position now is 1, and the letter at position 1 is 0, and so on down the list. So as we go through the loop, we can print out the position of each of the characters, and we can pull the character out of the string as if it were an item in a list and print those out as well. So that's an important thing and a strong capability that you have with Python. You can treat a string as a list. Now, I think we have put enough information into this video, so I'm going to close it